They say that on certain nights when there is little wind in the Ozark Mountains, the silence seems to hold stories that were never told, as if the earth, tired of witnessing secrets, simply accepted what it could not prevent. And before continuing, the researcher who narrates these archives discreetly invites the viewer to write in the comments which city they are watching from and what time it is now, almost like someone noting additional coordinates for an old document. The case that has resurfaced in recent years after the rediscovery of a small wooden box in the Marion County archives involves two sisters little known outside the region, Eleanor and Martha Caldwyn, lonely, discreet women who, from a very young age, carried alone the work of the small farm inherited from their parents. Records show that they were viewed with a mixture of respect and distance by the few residents in the surrounding area, not out of fear, but because of the kind of quiet reserve that accompanies families marked by hard lives and losses that leave no room for frivolity. The setting was the winter of 1878, one of the driest of the decade, when fine dust from the trails accumulated in pockets, on roofs, in wells, and on clothes hung out to air. The sisters' farm was located on a hill known as Sisters Ridge, an isolated spot in the mountains where the wind always seemed to arrive before the news. There, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the barn, and an almost constant mist formed near the small valley that led to the stream. The isolation was so striking that, according to testimonies from the time, weeks could go by without anyone passing through the wooden gate. The sisters had distinct personalities. Eleanor, the eldest, was withdrawn, almost silent, and completely dedicated to maintaining the place. Martha, 4 years younger, was observant, sensitive to detail, and known for keeping a notebook where she recorded changes in the weather, the movements of travelers, and small everyday events. An unusual habit for women in the region, but fundamental to the archives reconstructed today. The surrounding community, consisting of a few scattered farms and small family ranches, saw the Caldwyns as resilient women, but marked by some kind of discreet sadness. The local priest would write years later that when he visited Sisters Ridge to bring supplies or news from the parish, he noticed a silence thicker than usual, as if the house carried something that no one dared to name. There is no evidence that this was related to extraordinary events, only to the harshness of life in that stretch of the mountains. It is in this setting that, in archives dated late November 1878, the first mention appears of the presence of 18 horsemen who are said to have passed through the region during a sudden storm. Small fragments of reports indicate that they were seeking shelter for men and animals after long hours on eroded trails, and that the sisters, despite their initial fright, allowed them to occupy the attic of the old barn, a large space used to store hay bales during the winter. The arrival of so many strangers in a single day was extremely unusual, almost improbable, and this already casts a shadow of strangeness over the episode. But the most disturbing point in the documents is not the presence of the horsemen, but what was found the next morning. As the authorities of the time tried to reconstruct the steps taken during the night, the same observation repeatedly arose in different statements. In the attic where the 18 men had rested, all that remained were gloves lined up on the wooden floor, as if someone had carefully left them there. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no recent tracks in the mud. There were no footprints leading down the trail. There were not even any signs of horses, even though they had been seen arriving. Only the gloves, arranged in 2 imperfect rows, like a silent inventory of men who would never be seen again. The official records end abruptly at this first mention, as if something even stranger were about to be revealed, something that would make the community itself suspect that the sisters knew more than they were saying. It is precisely this gap that this account delves into. The wooden box found in the archive, however, contains a detail that does not appear in the formal documents, a small detail, but one capable of changing the course of the investigation. A note made by Martha the night before the disappearance. And this is where the mystery really begins. In attempting to reconstruct the Caldwyn sisters' daily lives before the night, the 18 horsemen sought shelter at Sisters Ridge. The researcher is forced to piece together fragments. Martha's scattered notes, comments from neighbors collected years later, and small purchase records made at the Valley store. The lives of the two sisters were neither grand nor exceptional at first glance. They were just one of many quiet existences scattered throughout the mountains, where the days seemed to pass more slowly, but took their toll in fatigue and loneliness. Eleanor woke up before sunrise. Reports describe how, while it was still dark, she would light the kitchen lamp, heat water in an iron pot, and stir the coffee while the first sounds of the wind brushed against the wooden walls. Martha would come in a few minutes later, wrapped in a worn shawl, carrying the hardcover notebook she kept by her bed. There, with almost stubborn discipline, she would jot down small observations: the date, the color of the sky at dawn, the behavior of the animals in the corral, whether the mail was late or early. The farm was simple. A wooden main house with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a small front porch, and, a few meters away, the barn that sometimes served as a storage room, shelter for animals, and on rare occasions, an improvised lodging for travelers. The attic of this barn, where the horsemen would later spend the night, was used to store bales of hay, some old boxes, and objects that belonged to the sisters' parents. A saddle that no one used anymore, a trunk with winter clothes, and a broken clock that had never been repaired. The days followed a predictable rhythm. In the morning, Eleanor took care of the heaviest tasks, milking the only cow, checking the fences, making sure the well showed no signs of contamination. Martha helped when necessary, but she also seemed to have an eye on what was happening outside. The distant sound of wagon wheels on the main trail, the smoke that sometimes rose from other properties, the sudden changes in the wind that, according to her, heralded more than just variations in the weather. The few neighbors who left testimonies paint a similar picture. One of them, a man named Thomas Bricker, said that whenever he passed Sisters Ridge, he would see Martha standing at the fence, her hands resting on the wood and her gaze fixed ahead, as if waiting for something that never came. It wasn't a look of fear, he wrote. It was more like someone trying to decipher some kind of warning that only she seemed to sense. In the months leading up to the disappearance, there are small signs that something, in the sisters' perception, was out of place. On one of the preserved pages of Martha's notebook, dated October 27, 1878, she notes that she noticed an unusual flow of horsemen on the trail leading north. They were not necessarily the same men who would appear later, but the record shows her unease. Today I counted 5 different groups, all heading north. It's not common. I don't know of any fair or gathering in the county. Eleanor says it's just the season, but it doesn't seem that way to me. Another excerpt, a few days later, mentions noises at night. There is no reference to extraordinary phenomena, only to the annoyance of hearing hooves in the early hours of the morning, with no one knocking at the gate. Martha notes that at dawn she did not see as clear tracks as she had expected, as if the ground were drier than it actually was. In marginal notes, she writes the word strange twice, underlined. Eleanor, on the other hand, seems to have dealt with these details in a more practical way. A receipt from Marion's store shows that she purchased more salt, flour, and beans than usual for just 2 people. When questioned by the owner, she reportedly replied only that winter could be longer and that it was better to be prepared. A few years later, in a statement given in his old age, the merchant said he remembered one detail. She spoke as if she were preparing not only for the cold, but also for having more people around. I can't explain why. The relationship between the 2 sisters, despite their constant physical proximity, had nuances that the records capture only at a glance. There is mention of minor disagreements about whether or not to accept occasional guests. Martha, the younger sister, seemed to feel a mixture of curiosity and fear toward strangers. Eleanor, more pragmatic, considered that in situations of need, denying shelter was to risk friction with men who might not react well. The parish priest noted in 1877 that he had found the 2 discussing discreetly about opening the house too much to strangers, although neither of them went into detail on the subject. In the days leading up to the arrival of the 18 horsemen, the routine was marked by a specific atmosphere of suspense. The wind changed direction, bringing thicker dust from the south. The stream began to flow more slowly. The animals, according to Martha, seemed restless at dawn, but too calm at sunrise. None of this, taken alone, would be enough to arouse suspicion. But taken together, these elements gain weight when read from a distance, decades later, by eyes that already know the outcome. One detail in particular stands out. Martha's notes begin to get shorter, and on some days she records nothing but the date and a single sentence. On a page from early November we read, "There are more footsteps on the road than eyes in the church." On another page, a few days later, "It seems that someone is always a little behind on their own path." For those who read these records as simple, poetic observations, it may all sound like rambling. But in the context of subsequent investigations, these excerpts were seriously discussed by the authorities at the time. Was it just Martha's peculiar way of recording the feeling of unusual movement in the region? Or did she sense a kind of growing pressure on the trails, something that would somehow culminate that night? The surrounding community, though scattered, also noticed certain changes. A distant neighbor reported that, on a November afternoon, he saw two horsemen standing at the crossroads below Sisters Ridge, talking quietly. When they realized they were being watched, they rode on without looking up the hill. That same neighbor would say years later that he felt a strange nervousness in that scene, as if the men were deciding something they didn't want to be overheard. Meanwhile, on the farm, the chores continued. Eleanor took care of keeping everything running, perhaps to avoid giving in to restlessness. Martha, however, wrote less and observed more. There is a page, near the end of the notebook, where the handwriting seems to press harder on the paper, as if she had written with urgency. Today the wind has changed, and with it the sound of hooves. I can't tell if it's men looking for a way, or a way looking for men. This sentence is followed by a larger than usual blank space, as if she had interrupted her writing in the middle of a thought. From this point on, Martha's notes enter into a sequence of dates without comment, as if something had made her abandon the habit, just as events were approaching a critical point. On the back of one of these pages, almost erased by a dark ink stain, there is, however, a sentence that investigators would only notice many years later, when examining the notebook under a different light. If those who have not yet arrived are the same ones who will not be able to leave, it is better that the attic be ready. It was the last complete sentence before the night when the 18 horsemen would climb the Sisters Ridge Trail. And from then on, all that remained to be told would depend not only on the sisters' words, but also on the silence of the gloves lined up on the wooden floor, waiting for explanations that never fully came. The records consulted by the researcher show that the night of the disappearance began, like so many others, in the late fall of 1878, with a harsh wind blowing down the slopes and an opaque, starless sky trapped between slow clouds that brought no rain, only a cold that seemed to grow from the inside out. The Caldwyn sisters finished their daily chores before sunset, perhaps out of intuition, perhaps just because the light was fading too quickly that week. Eleanor collected the buckets and closed the chicken coop door. Martha remained on the porch for a few minutes, watching a stretch of the trail disappear behind a curve of rocks. According to later reconstructions, it was shortly after nightfall that the first sounds appeared. Not footsteps, but a specific kind of rhythm that only tired riders produce. Hooves that hesitate, take a deep breath, drag dust, regain strength, and continue. Martha would report, in a still fragmented statement taken days later, that she noticed the sound even before the light from the lanterns reached the trail. It was as if the ground was coming first, she said, in a phrase that investigators noted without knowing exactly what it meant. The sisters were not accustomed to so many travelers. When Eleanor opened the door to look out, she saw only the silhouettes of horses and men approaching, moving slowly, grouped together as if they did not want to disperse in the dark. There were 18 of them, although this number was only confirmed later, when the statements were cross-checked. At that moment it all boiled down to the impression of a group too large to be ignored and too tired to be refused. The horsemen stopped in front of the house. Eleanor's lamp partially illuminated their faces, men covered in dust, some with thick blankets on their shoulders, others holding the reins with hands stiffened by the cold. They did not look threatening, but there was something in the way they breathed, a deep weariness, almost a silent urgency. What they said first has been lost in the archives. There is only an indication that they asked for shelter for a few hours, as the trail was dangerous, and that they offered to pay with what they had. Small coins, flour, leather. Eleanor accepted without hesitation, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because she understood that to refuse would be to risk more than she intended. Martha led the men to the barn, climbing the wooden stairs that creaked with every step. The attic, though simple, offered safe shelter from the wind blowing from the east. Some horses were tied up inside the barn, others in the shade of a sloping oak tree. Martha later described how the animals seemed restless. They moved their legs impatiently, snorted in the cold air, but quieted down whenever someone stroked their necks. One of the most intriguing parts of the records is the description of the environment inside the attic. The sisters climbed up with lanterns, illuminating the large, silent space. There were stacked bales, boxes, ropes, and a carpet of fine dust that rose with each step. The men settled in without complaint, some leaning against the walls, others arranging blankets on the floor. One of them asked if the barn was safe from strong winds. Eleanor replied that despite its age, the structure could withstand more than it looked like. For a while there was only silence and breathing. The men spoke quietly among themselves, almost whispering. Martha noticed that none of them had completely removed their gloves when settling in. Some just loosened their fingers, making room for the cold air to escape. The researcher notes in his analysis that this detail would prove crucial later, not because it contained anything extraordinary, but because it would contrast with what would be found the next morning. The sisters returned home. Inside, the lamp illuminated little more than the wooden table. Eleanor served a simple broth, but they did not eat immediately. Both were restless. Every minute the wind seemed to change direction, making small cracks on the outside wall. Martha, according to her testimony, couldn't stop thinking about the look in the horsemen's eyes, as if they were coming from a place they didn't want to describe. It wasn't fear. It was more like someone who carries haste and silence at the same time. Shortly before midnight, something happened that the archives treat with extreme caution. There were no screams, no sudden noises, no running. There was only a sudden sound, a sharp impact, as if something had fallen in the barn loft. The sisters heard it from inside the house. Eleanor got up slowly, holding the lamp firmly. Martha approached the window, trying to see through the darkness. The wind had stopped, suddenly and strangely. The silence that filled the space seemed denser than the night itself. Eleanor went out first. The door creaked. Martha followed. The two walked slowly to the barn, trying to identify if anyone needed help. When they reached the door, they realized that no horses were neighing, no movement was coming from inside, only the smell of stirred dust. The sisters called out to the men. There was no answer. The attic ladder, when touched, was cold, colder than would be expected inside a closed barn. Eleanor climbed up first, holding the lamp aloft. Martha followed close behind. Accounts differ as to which of them saw the scene first, but all versions agree on the essentials. The attic was completely empty. The men had disappeared. There were no used blankets, no backpacks, no tools. There were no boot marks on the floor, except for those that were already there. There was no sign of recent movement, as if no one had come down the stairs. The only clue that the attic had been occupied by 18 tired men was the gloves, all lined up in 2 crooked rows, resting on the wooden floor. Each pair was arranged with the palms facing up. Some gloves had accumulated dust. Others looked too clean, as if they had been delicately placed there seconds before. The researcher who re-examined the gloves decades later wrote that their arrangement seemed less a ritual gesture and more an interrupted act, as if the men had been called away urgently and had removed their gloves in the process, but with no time for anything else. The most intriguing thing, however, was not in the attic, but on the ground floor. When Eleanor went back downstairs, she realized that the horses had also disappeared. The ropes remained tied in the same knots, but they were loose with no tension. There were no recent marks on the ground. There were no footprints. There was no indication that animals of that size had left the barn during the night. In her statement to the sheriff the next day, Eleanor said a sentence that was noted verbatim. "I can't explain it. I just saw that everything that should have made noise didn't." The reconstruction of the case adds another crucial detail. When the sisters returned home to try to figure out what to do, Martha found a small folded leaf in her shawl pocket, written in the tense handwriting of someone who had tried to jot something down too quickly. The origin of the leaflet was never confirmed, but its content, preserved in the archive, is still debated today. If we leave together, we lose our way. If we stay, we waste time. Investigators were unable to determine who wrote this sentence, but it was there, and there was no one else on the farm. The notebook ends with the moment when Eleanor, still holding the lamp trembling in her hands, opens the door of the house to look at the trail again. The wind did not return, the night remained still, and at the top of the ridge, very close to the curve, there was the impression of one last detail, something so small that the first investigators completely ignored it, until one of them, years later, revisiting the report, noticed something that would change the way the case was interpreted. There were footprints, a single sequence, going up, not down, the trail, and they did not belong to the sisters or the horsemen. The next day dawned pale, as if the light avoided touching Sisters Ridge too insistently. The Caldwyn sisters had remained awake, sitting at the table, unsure whether to go down the trail in search of help or wait for a traveler to pass by. But no one passed by. The silence remained as thick as it had been at dawn, and even the birds seemed to have postponed their songs. When the sun finally rose behind the mountains, bringing a faint glow over the valley, Eleanor made the decision to walk to the Bricker farm, about 40 minutes to the east. That was how the first reports reached the authorities. Thomas Bricker described that, upon seeing Eleanor approaching, he immediately sensed something was wrong. She walked slowly but steadily, like someone who needs to keep their body moving to prevent their mind from collapsing. He invited her in, but she simply said, "They're gone. All of them." According to witnesses, Thomas's wife did not understand what she was talking about until Eleanor added, "The horsemen. The gloves are still here, that's all." Upon hearing this, Thomas decided to accompany his older sister back to the farm. The journey was made in silence, except for the cautious questions he asked, questions that Eleanor answered with disconcerting simplicity, as if each word were carefully chosen so as not to break something inside her. When they reached the barn, Thomas climbed the attic ladder and saw exactly what the records described. The gloves, lined up with unsettling precision, and no other clues. The community's first reaction was disbelief. Some believed that the men had left without saying goodbye, perhaps because they had received urgent news. But that hypothesis was short-lived. There were no traces of horses, no fresh footprints, no signs of movement on the trail. The ground, still damp from the night, should have recorded any movement. It did not. In the late afternoon, the local sheriff, Benjamin Rourke, arrived at the farm accompanied by 2 assistants. He patiently inspected the barn, noting everything he saw. In the official report, there is a passage that stands out. The arrangement of objects suggests order, not haste, but the absence of all the men suggests haste, not order. This contradiction would become the focus of investigations for weeks. Martha, unlike Eleanor, behaved more reservedly during her testimony. She answered all questions, but always with hesitation, as if she feared that any detail could be misinterpreted. She repeated several times that she heard only one sound in the early morning, the sharp impact in the attic, and that the silence that followed left her more uneasy than the noise itself. At no point did she change this version of events. The news spread quickly throughout the region, and within 3 days, more than 20 residents had volunteered to help with the search. The terrain was combed. Ravines and stretches of dense vegetation were examined. The creek was searched from end to end. Nothing was found. No abandoned saddles, no clothing, no traces. The disappearance then began to generate rumors, not out of malice, but out of the community's effort to find explanations that would fill the void left by the lack of answers. Some suggested that the men might have been part of a group involved in disputes in the north, and that, as a precaution, they had left quietly before dawn. Others believed they had been ambushed on the trail. But none of these hypotheses stood up to basic examination of the evidence. The lack of marks outside the barn ruled out any theory of escape or attack. One of the most debated clues was the sequence of footprints going up the trail, mentioned in the report revised years later. At the time, however, this detail apparently went unnoticed or was considered irrelevant, as searches focused on the lower valley, not the upper slopes of the ridge. The researcher notes that this oversight may have compromised understanding of what really happened that night. As for the folded sheet of paper found in Martha's pocket, the authorities were unable to evaluate it immediately. Some suspicions fell on the young woman herself, but Sheriff Rourke quickly ruled out this line of investigation when he verified that the handwriting did not match hers or Eleanor's. The paper was also different from what the sisters used, thinner, almost translucent. The enigmatic and brief phrase it contained was filed away with the other evidence without explanation. If we go out together, we lose our way. If we stay, we waste time. As the weeks passed, the case ceased to be seen as an isolated event and began to be discussed in a more serious tone. Some local deputies were pressured to send reinforcements to the investigation, but nothing new emerged. The sisters, who were initially treated as witnesses, began to attract involuntary suspicion. Not because of any direct suspicion, there was no reason for that, but because of the way they seemed to carry a silent knowledge, as if something from that night had escaped them for a moment and remained trapped between memory and oblivion. Martha wrote less and less. Eleanor rarely left the farm. The priest visited the sisters twice and mentioned in a preserved letter that home seemed to be waiting for someone, but he couldn't tell if it was waiting for a return or an explanation. The community gradually resumed its routine, but always with the impression that something unfinished hung over Sisters Ridge. The barn remained standing, and the gloves remained filed away as evidence, catalogued, numbered, analyzed, with nothing conclusive found. Almost 6 months later, in early spring, a new element emerged. Not on the trail, nor in the barn, but in Martha's own notebook, which remained stored in a drawer in the kitchen table. Leafing through it, she found a page she had not seen before. A small entry dated the day of the disappearance, written irregularly, with more shaky handwriting than usual. The text contained only 3 lines. They arrived tired. They climbed up in silence, but one of them was not looking for shelter. This last sentence, compared to the statements already collected, opened up a new possibility: the presence of someone in the group whose intention was not to rest, but to observe or search for something. However, no one in the region ever came forward claiming to know the horsemen, nor were there any reports linking the group to local crimes or conflicts. And so, with no new answers, the case was slowly swallowed up by time. The sisters lived for many years after the episode, increasingly isolated, and never left Sisters Ridge. The barn was renovated, but the attic remained closed, as if both sisters knew that nothing inside, or the absence found there, could be reorganized or erased. Sheriff Rourke closed the report 6 months later with a sentence that would become emblematic: "We don't know where they went, nor why they left the gloves. What we do know is that they did not return by the same trail they came in on." And in the footnote of one of the pages, years later, an anonymous assistant wrote a comment that would become the hook for the final reflection of this narrative. If the footprints went up the ridge, perhaps what was missing was not in the barn, but above it. Decades have passed since that night on Sisters Ridge, and even today, when researchers open the archive boxes related to the case, silence seems to accompany each page they handle. It is not the usual silence of archive rooms, but an older silence, impregnated in the wood, the paper, and even the empty spaces between the reports, as if time recognized that certain stories cannot be completely explained, only preserved with the care of those who know that the essential may lie in what is missing. The Caldwyn sisters died within a few years of each other, both still on the farm where they had lived their entire lives. Eleanor, the eldest, was found on the porch, sitting in her wooden chair, looking out over the valley as she used to do in the late afternoon. Martha died inside the house, with the closed notebook beside her bed and her hand still resting on the cover. Neither of them left letters explaining what they saw or heard on the night of the disappearance. Neither changed their story over the years. Neither tried to reopen the attic. Over time, the surrounding community changed. Families arrived, others moved away, some trails were abandoned. The barn was partially overgrown with vegetation, and the original structure of the attic eventually collapsed in parts, until finally, for safety reasons, the building was closed off and left as a historical relic. The sisters' house, however, remained standing, empty but preserved, as if resisting not the weather but oblivion. Upon re-examining the material, the researcher realizes that the strength of this case lies not in the investigative gaps, but in the humanity of small choices, in the lined-up gloves which suggest order amid disappearance, in the note found in Martha's pocket, which speaks of time and path as if she knew in advance of a tension greater than the mountains could bear, in the footprints climbing ridge, ignored at the time, but now examined as if they contained a hidden intention, and also in the brief phrases left by Martha, phrases that, read out of context, would seem to be just the reflections of an observant woman, but in light of what happened, seem like fragments of a deep and silent understanding of the land where she lived. Some say she simply recorded what she saw. Others believe she was sensitive enough to pick up on movements that escaped others. There is no way to know. Time does not give back what it keeps. In writing this reconstruction, the researcher tries to imagine the sisters' feelings in the early morning when they climbed up to the attic. The still air, the lamp trembling slightly, the sound of their own footsteps echoing on the wood, the expectation of finding men sleeping, perhaps frightened, perhaps exhausted, and instead finding only gloves, a barn full of absence, a night full of questions that made no noise, but weighed more than any possible explanation. Sheriff Rourke, in his last note on the case, wrote, "There are occurrences that cannot be resolved. They can only be accepted, because what disappears is not just people. It is the moment when we should have understood something and did not. And perhaps that is the ultimate essence of Sisters Ridge. Not the search for the men, not the reconstruction of their steps, not the attempts to explain what leaves no trace, but the realization that certain events cross the collective memory like fine scars, visible only when you look very closely." Walking through the old property many years later, the researcher describes how the wind blew irregularly, dragging dry leaves against the boards of the house. He stopped in front of the fence where, according to old accounts, Martha used to lean to watch the trail. From that point, it is possible to see the narrow curve of the mountain and the long stretch of land that descends toward the valley. Nothing there hints that such a profound story unfolded in that place. Nothing betrays the absence of 18 men. Nothing except for the uncomfortable feeling that something is missing, not on the ground, but in the human narrative. The researcher then turned his attention to the top of the ridge, the stretch where, according to the revised report, there were footprints going up the slope. Today, almost nothing remains but loose stones and hardy shrubs, but even so, there is a kind of natural slope that suggests a path that no longer exists. A kind of trail erased by decades of wind. He wrote in his diary, "Perhaps what we are looking for is not in what has been lost, but in what no one has observed carefully enough. Perhaps we should not have asked where they went, but why they arrived." This reflection sums up the weight that the case has acquired over the years, because in the end, all that is known is that 18 horsemen sought shelter in the attic of a barn and were never seen again. There is no evidence of escape, attack, conflict, or accident. There are only objects left behind, words jotted down hastily, and a trail that climbs when all questions turn to the valley. Upon closing the file, the researcher understands that certain stories survive not for what they reveal, but for what they keep suspended. The silence surrounding them becomes part of the narrative, as if the mountains preserved a pact with what could not be explained. A pact of respect, not mystery. And perhaps that is why even today, when the sun sets behind Sisters Ridge, the valley seems to hold its breath for a few moments. Not out of fear, but out of memory. The researcher walks away, knowing that nothing he has written provides answers, but preserves the questions. And that may be the only honest way to conclude a story like this. And so ends the reconstructed account of the night when 18 men sought shelter in the attic of a barn in the Ozark Mountains, and disappeared without warning, without a sound, and without a trace. The last thing that remains is just a silent impression, the feeling that, in that place, what was missing was never seen,